Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. There's still quite a few people logging in, so we're going to give them a few minutes to get settled, and we'll get started shortly. Thank you. Cool. For those who are just joining us, thank you again for joining us. We're still seeing quite a few people logging in, so we're just going to give another couple of minutes, and we'll get started shortly. Thank you. Alrighty, thanks for being patient, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. So welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joining. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Safe and Secure, How Generative AI Empowers Insurers to Drive Efficiency Without Compromising Security, with Tom Wild, CEO at Indico Data, and Jim DeMarco, America's Insurance Leader at Microsoft. My name is Caroline Sue. I'm Senior Marketing Manager at Indico Data, and I'm excited to be hosting today's session. But before we get started with today's webinar, I wanted to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, the webinar will be on demand after the live session. We'll be sure to send up a follow-up note after the webinar with a link to the recording. And next, we'd love to hear from you throughout today's session. So if you do have a question for our speakers, please be sure to use the Q&A function in the control panel of the GoToWebinar function, and we'll be answering your questions at the end of the webinar. If we don't get to your question today, we'll be sure to follow up afterwards. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jim and Tom to get us started. Thank you all.
Excellent. Thanks, Caroline. Appreciate it. Jim, great to talk to you today. A very fascinating topic, and I think some interesting sort of points of convergence with Microsoft and Indico on this topic. So looking forward to chatting with you for the next hour here about it.
Same here, Tom. It's great to chat with you again, as always.
Excellent. Well, why don't we get started? Obviously, generative AI and GPT is a white hot topic in the industry generally, and certainly in insurance holds great promise and some challenges as well. Maybe it'd be good if we start with some context and history. Tell us a bit about Microsoft's journey, if you could, around generative AI particularly, and then as we go through the conversation today, we can work our way towards opportunities and challenges within insurance specifically, but maybe set the table a bit for us around Microsoft's history with this technology.
Sure, happy to. Any question that ever is asked about the history of Microsoft in any respect is going to have Bill Gates in the story somewhere, right? 1991, Bill Gates created Microsoft Research, and actually what he was working on was the idea of how do we look at technology that would enable machines to learn. So our very first foray into research and sort of in the sort of classical Bell Labs, sort of how do I understand what's going to happen next in industry, started with the question of what do we do to teach machines how to learn. That was some of the seminal work on machine learning, and then ultimately artificial intelligence came out of that group. That was over 30 years ago.
Right.
I'm not going to give you a 30-year blow-by-blow of Microsoft's history. Let's fast forward a bit, though. Over the course of the next 20 or so years, we developed a whole bunch of things around how to make query more intelligent, how to understand how do machines start asking questions better, and so on. And machine learning really evolved until the mid-20 teens as a way of looking at discriminative models and understand how to actually learn the next question from the last one. Around 2015 or so, we started getting much more into the use of neural networks and then into the cognitive AI space, where we really got into looking at how to enable the emulation of human actions like sight, touch, and so on. It's fair to say that that's also when generative AI really got going. In fact, I credit Indico enormously in this because your co-founders actually wrote the white paper that sort of generated the idea of generative AI. And that was an area where we sort of captured not that Microsoft wasn't trying to be the lead or only player. We really saw some really brilliant players out there like your folks. So our role in this place was to really enable that to grow. And Microsoft's been very happy to be a key player in the last few years, really helping with the platforms that enable things like OpenAI and their whole model, and what you've done with respect to generative AI as well. So that's sort of the brief history of Microsoft in this space.
Oh, that's terrific. And when you think about why now, what's the inflection point that caused, because as you point out, it's not that, and we can get into a bit more of the history of generative AI in a moment here, but it's not that the technology just arrived yesterday. So what's the inflection here? What happened to cause, GPT to become a dinner conversation, this past year, as opposed to the years before?
Yeah, I'd say there's three things that have happened. And I desperately also want to point out Indico has been a significant player in this space right from the get-go. So I want to come back to that and ask you to sort of lead us through that. But I'll sort of set the table a little bit if I can on it. The things that have made this such a hot topic now. One, compute got a whole lot cheaper. The cloud happened, essentially. We were able to bring the kind of compute that is needed to do these better, more complicated models to everybody. I think that's one point. Another is that the data has become more available. The idea of actually being able to ground data and having a large base that you can actually train models on, that's a sort of a factor of the cloud as well. The third one is that very clever people, and this is where it'd be really great to sort of talk a little bit about Indico, have figured out how to create a level of sophistication in artificial intelligence models that has just heretofore not existed. And it's worthwhile sort of talking through that a little bit in sort of your perspective, because then we can talk through, all right, what happened, the great moment of 2019 or 2022, where we suddenly saw, hey, what's this GPT stuff? That, if you wouldn't mind, would you sort of give us sort of the background on Indico in that respect as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It literally started as a dorm room startup story, which sort of, almost sounds too good to be true. And in a funny small world story, the company was started at the Olin College of Engineering, which is about 500 yards out the window to my left here. So little to my knowledge, while I was working here in my home office, rolling back 7-8 years ago, the Olin students had really seized on a strong interest in deep learning, right? So deep learning had sort of started to arrive as a commercially viable technology for many of the reasons you described, the compute, the data, and the algorithms to do that. That was sort of kicked off by the famous Google paper, "Attention is all you need," and the transformer architectures that power deep learning. And when I met the founders, and they described for me, the disruption that was coming with these transformer-based architectures, combined with, my experience, 25 years in the enterprise software space, mostly in content technology. So I'd been using OCR and semantic search and, studying the semantic web and all those things that held a lot of promise, but never quite delivered what we were all hoping as an industry, which is true, so computer comprehension of unstructured data. It certainly got my attention. And when we think about, the sort of founding of the technology broadly and Indico specifically, the founders at Indico created a paper called DC GANs, which really kicked off this idea of generative AI and the ability for this technology to really comprehend natural language. And that led to GPT, GPT-2, GPT-3, and now we're up to GPT-4 and beyond. So that was sort of the technology arc behind the company. What we really recognized is and needed to point the technology, as you do with any disruptive technology, pointed at a specific problem space that will add value, will drive an outcome for customers. So we don't consider ourselves as much a deep tech company as we do an application company, specifically focused on a number of automation capabilities around insurance and financial services, which we can get into here over the course of the conversation.
It's cool. I'd love to tie these sort of two things together because we are now at this moment, as you said. And
yep.
one of the things that's there is we laid the groundwork technologically across frameworks and application sets and really the sort of cool things that have gone on. But I think there's also been a fundamental change in the market that's actually happened. We finally got to the tipping point where stuff was usable. I think one of the challenges we faced in the AI space for decades has been we had to train people to be experts in the technology in order to use it.
That's right.
And we don't anymore. Now, one of the things that we really understand is that if we can actually use this technology in a manner where any human can go do it, go do a Bing search, ask the chat window, go do a Bard search, ask in chat format, something in human language and get a human response. It's now far more intuitive for end users. And that's the difference between, that's why people, everybody can drive a car, but nobody can fly an airplane. It's because you have to do a lot of training to fly an airplane. You have to do some training to drive a car too, that's fair, but at the same time, it's a whole lot less and a whole lot more people can do it. And I think we've hit that tipping point. And one of the cool things now is, all right, well, what are the problems we want to solve? And I think that's one of the things that we're now shifting toward is we're shifting towards understanding that it's not about the tech, it's about the problem we solve. And that's where I'm really thrilled about what Indigo's done, because you guys have actually come in with this idea of, let me focus in on a fundamental problem. I got all kinds of data coming in, insurance companies have pretty much more than anybody else, all kinds of data coming in, and now what do I do with it? Because I can't just sit there and manually sift through it like I've been doing for decades.
Yeah, and just to build on that point, one of the core philosophies we have is right in line with what you were describing, how to make this technology accessible to a business user. If you think about the history of machine learning and data science, rolling back a decade or so, to train machine learning to be proficient, you might need hundreds of thousands of ground truth samples to teach it any kind of, for it to behave in any kind of proficient manner. That meant that practically speaking, it was out of reach of all but, true research profile type folks. What these technologies and Indigo specifically have been able to do is we took that from tens or hundreds of thousands of examples down to just 100 or 200 examples. We added a point and click interface so that you didn't need a data science background or expertise, and you could now build a highly proficient custom machine learning model that could interpret your data, in a matter of a couple of days. So we took it from what was often 6 to 12 months to a couple of days. And I think generative AI has now reduced that even further, especially, with the partnership that we announced with you a couple months ago. That can now be taken down to, we think, hours. So that is a dramatic shift and really a democratization of access to this technology. The art of enterprise software is making the complex and the powerful accessible to a business user, because ultimately, I think what IT departments have learned is it's one thing to license these powerful technologies, but if they become yet another bottleneck in the deployment and use of these technologies, that only makes their life more difficult, not less difficult. So they're very eager now with the line of business to get technology that can be provisioned out to the end user. And I think, Microsoft talks about it as the co-pilot. We often describe it as the bionic arm. And I think that's a really apt way to describe it. We can get into that in more detail. But thinking about it that way as opposed to a robot which is going to come in and simply complete 100% of the task, which is not a realistic framing at this point.
Yeah, but that sort of brings us to the point of like what's going on industry-wise that's actually caused this to be the flavor of the day, if you will.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the flavor of the day, frankly. I think it's the flavor of the decade. This is because this is exactly what we're seeing. And in the industry, particularly in the insurance patch, we're not seeing people going, hey, I have tons of money I can go throw around these days. Anybody in the property casualty space has just done an eye roll as they're listening to us on that one, because frankly, costs have gone up. Loss ratios are going in the wrong direction, and in the life space, we're seeing the need to get much more crisp about how we engage with customers, because customers, they're different. There's a different age when you have digital first customers than when you had customers who were buying the same insurance product that mom and dad had.
Yep.
Right. And so as we're seeing that shift, the problems that we need to solve need to be about driving efficiency, whether that's efficiency of conversation in life and in simpler ways to apply for life insurance in the consumer space, or in commercial insurance submissions, or for that matter, handling claims. It's quite an interesting need that is probably going to get, how do I put it? It's going to get worse before it gets better in some respects. It's the need to drive efficiencies is pretty high. So this seems like it's not just the technology has met its moment. Also, I think the industry has met its moment. I wanted to get your take, what you're seeing, and then maybe talk a little bit about what I'm seeing too in that respect.
That's perfect. Yeah, I think that we're sort of at the maybe not the end, but we're sort of at the peak of productivity around the innovation in engagement with customers. And that has really been driven by 10 to 20 years of investment in mobile, right? Mobile was absolutely transformative in how insurance companies engage and interact with their customers and prospects. As a consumer, we can all relate to that, right? If you want to file a claim, if you want to interact with your insurance company, you're probably doing it through their mobile app, and that's by design. Now, in the middle office, the way I describe the middle office, where key decisions are made, should I underwrite this risk? Should I adjudicate this claim? Those have primarily been left out of that revolution, right? Mobile hasn't really driven that, especially in commercial lines. Commercial lines is still very much the way I describe it, a Tower of Babel. You have a many-to-many relationship. You have a very large, broker industry and a very large carrier industry, and they all want to interact with each other to find, on the broker side, the best price and coverage for their customers. On the carrier side, the right risk and the right price, and in the case of claims adjudication, make sure that the claims are serviced in a timely manner and in a financially viable manner. So what I see in talking to customers, I'll start with underwriting, because I think there's a set of acute challenges there. The first is, I like to joke that email is still the biggest API in the industry, if you want to think about it that way, right? So if we think about email as an API, well, it's literally how most brokers and carriers interact today. Not exclusively, but it's still a dominant way that data is transmitted. And so what happens is, carriers are receiving thousands and thousands of submissions from brokers, and because traditionally they've been attacking that in a manual fashion, they can't literally open and comprehend the full river of submissions they're getting. They have to simply, process as many as they can, and then the rest they just, set aside. Second, they're not even sure, because most of them do kind of a last in, first out kind of approach. They're not even sure that they're evaluating the right submissions that match their desired risk profile, et cetera. And then third, it still takes them too long to respond to the submission. And when you talk to the carriers and the brokers, the probability of winning the race to the finish line is dominated by speed, the speed to quote, right? So the fastest quote has a huge advantage over the next fastest quote, independent of price or coverage. So those things that are kind of the ball of yarn they're trying to unravel to solve and drive their business forward on the underwriting side.
Yeah, it's funny. I had that conversation with one of the leaders at one of the larger insurance companies this week, where they were explicit. I'd rather get speed than efficiency at this point.
Right.
Because particularly in the underwriting side, because it's the first answer that actually usually wins, not even necessarily the best answer that wins. That said, nobody wants to get the wrong answer, and I think that's part of I think that's also been part of it. The opportunity for us to drive accuracy, as you say, not just drive efficiency, is a key element of what we're seeing here. And it's not that the tech is necessarily able to replace humans. We haven't seen that. Anybody asked me, with this generative AI, how many humans can I replace? The answer is, good luck with that. It ain't gonna happen.
Yeah.
We're gonna make people's jobs a whole lot easier because we can stop you from having to go scrolling through those 10,000 emails in the day and your eyes glaze over and trying to figure out, is it the third email or the fifth email that had the right submission data in, and so on. I want to shift gears for a second because one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A about, we're talking a fair amount about efficiencies, but there's also a request, how do we look at safety and security? And in part, the context of the question is about historical data as well. We know we look at historical data, it's how we underwrite, just look at what happened in the past and then figure out, what is the future going to look like relative to the past. One of the challenges that seems inherent in the use of any technology is, how does it work once you throw the data at it? And I'd be curious from your perspective, because you guys were really major innovators in generative AI, how do we look at understanding the secure use of both historical data and submission data together?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a nice sort of corollary benefit to touch on. I like to describe the submissions as the river. Not that I've sort of invented this concept, but I think it's apt here, which is the submissions are really your river of data, and that data accumulates in a lake, right? So you have both a river a challenge to solve and a lake challenge, the lake being sort of the legacy data you're describing. And I think the other frustration that I hear from carriers when I talk to them is, we know we have value in that lake, we just can't get at it because it's unstructured and opaque. And we've done a few projects where the actuaries have come to us and said, hey, if only we could mine these 200,000-300,000 historical claims in our lake, we know we can improve our pricing and risk models. And by processing that lake, which you can do with our solution, we're able to increase the number of data points, the accuracy of those data points by order of magnitude. And that's just found intelligence that's sitting there, in these various bit buckets in these companies, waiting to be mined and put to use. So I think the river and the lake analogy is a really good one. I think when I think about safety, I always think about trustworthiness, right? And I think that's when generative AI has arrived now, we've all heard about hallucination and challenges with recall. The generative AI models are a little bit finicky, kind of peculiar animals. And one thing that you can't do when applying these technologies to these kinds of core commercial decisioning is not be able to govern those decisions, not be able to audit those decisions, not be able to trust those decisions. One of the quickest ways to get a piece of technology uninstalled or not utilized is for the end users to not trust it, because they're not going to put their reputation, their employment on the line by making a mistake that generative AI can lead them to. We've all now, I think, heard of the I guess it's an amusing story where the lawyer used GPT to create a series of citations in a court case, and those citations were made up by GPT, not knowing that it's not supposed to make up a citation, even though the citation looked perfectly legitimate, enough so to convince this lawyer that they were real citations. So that's a core driver, I think, and especially in terms of our engagement together. How do we deliver that to insurers? That trustworthiness is so vital when you're talking about underwriting tens of millions of dollars of risk or adjudicating multi-million-dollar claims.
Yeah, so I have a similar opinion. If you'll forgive me traipsing into a story for a moment, one of the things that we learned at Microsoft early on with the use of cognitive AI was you can really screw it up pretty badly if you do it wrong. Like the way we're not actually grounding any of his research. We launched something in 2016. We launched a chatbot called Tay. Well, it turns out apparently Tay is also a short for Taylor Swift, and the guys from Microsoft Research missed that one. But then it was an open chatbot, just thrown out on Twitter. How do I communicate? It was a way to learn and experience how to do chat early in the days of chatbots. And it took about, what, 24, 48 hours for it to, in a call and response manner, to become a really, really racist teenager. We obviously took it down within 24 hours, but it was a huge learning for the company along the way that you have to have guardrails in place when you use technology. We'd been putting guardrails in place on our tech for years, but somehow we missed it here. And I'm glad you brought up the responsible use of AI, Tom, because that's part of the story when we look at this technology. How do we put the appropriate guardrails in place? Microsoft then took a lesson from Tay. One, we actually took it as a global learning moment. I remember when it happened, I was in the company, and our CEO called an all hands meeting and said, I'm not firing the people who did this. We're going to use this as a company-wide learning moment. We opened what became the Office of Responsible AI for Microsoft. We turned around and created a whole set of principles around how technology and AI in particular should be used, must be used. And from our perspective, the guide rails on when we're allowed to use this technology, or even for that matter, sell it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, there's a reason it's called artificial intelligence. It is not true intelligence. I think it's why, we have invested a lot in the human in the loop aspects of our product to ensure that at all times users can do at least two of the following things. One, evaluate the output, confirm it, correct it, before sending it down to a final decisioning platform or decisioning person. And second, to be able to explain it at all times. And I think that explainability is really vital. Now, generative AI has tremendous capabilities. The word generative is a very important word to pay attention to. It is generating content, and that generation is not perfect. So the ability to validate that content back to source material, the original submissions, is really valuable and imperative. And both the explainability of the AI and the human in the loop access to the AI are simply must-haves if you're going to deploy this inside the enterprise. And those are two things that our product has always had and core to the philosophy we have about how to use this responsibly. And with the arrival of generative AI, how do you leverage its extraordinary capabilities? Because I think we all agree it is truly extraordinary as a technology moment, but do that responsibly. I mean, I think we will look back on the arrival of generative AI. It will be as revolutionary as the mobile phone, as the browser. It has that kind of impact potential, even though we're 5 minutes into it.
Yeah, I think I want to credit Indica without turning this into just a love fest, but I think you guys have actually done some amazing use of technology and business process that needs to be called out. Generative AI can generate content, as you say. The ability to then provide the link back to what sources did I look at is a way of, it gives us the ability to not only provide traceability, it provides a measure of protection and security around the decision making itself. Just from whether you think of it from a compliance perspective, and as we talk with the regulatory bodies about this quite a bit, the ability to actually turn around and say, hey, this is the output, but here's also the input. And then that connection is a key element of how it can be used in the real world at scale. The first time you come up with an output that doesn't have a link to the input is the first time that the regulators go, okay, that's great, you're done.
Yeah.
And also, frankly, it's a one-way ticket to making bad decisions. And so from that perspective, we have, what you've done around sort of mapping out not just generative AI, the citation piece, but actually doing the full loop with traceability is, I think, a key value that I think you guys bring to the table. That said, one of the questions that's come up has been the idea of, well, that's great, I can make these decisions that are grounded in my own data, but what if my own data is bad? Like what we all know that insurance data, particularly in the property space, is inherently biased. Insurance data in the life space is also pretty biased too in certain classifications. So from that perspective, there's been an interesting question that's been sort of looked at in research circles around can we use this technology to eliminate bias? And while it's not a question that necessarily comes up in every conversation, I thought it would be useful for us to just dip in on it a little bit, because we've seen in some of the stuff we've been looking at Microsoft with some of our customers, the question that's fundamentally related to eliminating bias. How do I compare what I have with what I already had with what I'm getting now? So how do I compare the information coming in a submission with my historical data? And the ability to say where you are and where you are not is actually the ability to find, using generative AI, a discriminatory model. That is to say, I can discriminate between the two pieces. One of the interesting things we're starting to see people use it for is identify where the historical data is not matching current from the perspective of the historical data is imbuing bias, particularly racial bias. So it's an interesting question for us. Is this technology ready for us to say, hey, we can eliminate bad data? I have an opinion on that. My opinion is no, not yet, but we're on the path to identify maybe where the gaps are in our historical data around bias. Any thoughts from your perspective on that?
One of the really interesting things about AI, and again, I'd like to kind of point out that word artificial, right? One of the really interesting opportunities it brings to the table is for us to codify the way we've been making decisions, right? It's a forcing function that hasn't really existed prior. So when you create an artificial intelligence approach to a problem, it forces you to really think hard about the training data, right? Because again, AI is as good as it's trained, or as bad as it's trained, to be honest. And so that forcing function allows for two things. One is you can really wring out bias in this decisioning, and bias takes many forms. It can be, there's the way I think the most popular way we think about bias, which is, racial or gender discrimination, those kinds of things. Those are sort of very negative bias outcomes. Then there's just bad decisioning, right? Like I'm underwriting risk I shouldn't. The model is, or our decisions have been biased historically in a way that we weren't even aware of. One of the fascinating things that we find when we deploy a new customer and we go through the training cycle to build the custom models and workflows to begin to deliver this bionic arm experience is pretty quickly, if you involve more than a handful of folks to provide contribution to that training data, you realize that there are different opinions sitting around the table that they weren't aware of, and that those decisions that they've been doing for 20 or 30 years have inherent variability that they were not tracking. And so to your point about sort of bad data, it forces, I've sat through some of these workshops with customers, and it forces some fascinating discussions around, well, wait a minute, how have we been making these decisions, underwriting, claims, et cetera? How should we be making these decisions? And forcing that discussion to get to a much better, sort of codification of the decisioning that they're trying to get with the company, and thus removing errors, removing bias, accelerating decisioning with confidence and trust. So it is artificial intelligence still. It's as good as you train it, but that's been a terrific forcing function, I think, to drive better decisioning.
That's yeah. So it sounds like we're seeing it. I think these are very early days, but there's actually some surprises, I think, in terms of this, because we've actually we've driven shall we say, a sharper look at process and how we've actually think about it. Hey, we've been doing this for decades. Wait a second. you've been doing the wrong things for decades. And not to say you've been wrong, just to say that we now have an opportunity, as you say, to really rethink where we are, just in terms of how we train or how we ground our data in an AI role, but also how do we even look at underwriting fundamentally?
Yeah, I think to your point, it's not necessarily they're doing it the wrong way, but they're not aware of the degree of variability in their decisions that they've made over the past decades. And so to trust the outcomes of the past decades is maybe a little bit of a risky thing. And quite literally, when we think about things like risk models and pricing models, going back in time and processing some of that historical data or reprocessing it allows for a better baseline. So definitely an opportunity there as well, to your point about being able to compare A to B and do that at scale, importantly, right? I think the actuarial use case I described, I think the customer had calculated it was going to take them 3 person years to do it manually, to get at that data manually. And therefore they said, well, we're not going to do that. They said, we just don't have time to do that. With this approach, they were able to do it in a few weeks, and have that data ready for use in these models. I mean, I always joke that, actuaries, when you think about it, they're sort of the original data scientists, right? I mean, if you go way back in time, they're the original data scientists. They appreciate this idea of high quality data in, high decision fidelity coming out more than anybody.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I'm going to shift gears for a sec on us, if you don't mind, because I thought it'd be useful, sort of, as we look at it. We've been talking about the sort of puppies and rainbows piece of our capabilities these days. Like, here's all the cool things we can do we didn't think we could do.
Right.
We know we can do a lot better with submissions now because, hey, you've got the ability to really read that. And we know that we can do an awful lot around just using summaries as summaries of data to actually then provide a new lens on the data. And that's been very cool. But I actually thought it'd be useful to talk a little bit about the part that we see misconceptions coming in. Like, what are some of the sort of common misconceptions you're seeing about what it can do and what it can't do, this new generative AI?
I think that some of our learnings that have been really interesting is just a little bit of human supervision to a generative AI approach has a dramatic positive effect on its capabilities. That it's a little naive to think you can just set it and forget it. That's not been our experience. That when we've compared that approach, complete hands-off, zero shot as it's known, to more small shot with a bit of supervision, boy, that's been a world of difference. So it's very consistent with this sort of co-pilot or bionic arm concept that is the best practice here, not just for trustworthiness, but for efficacy, for accuracy, if you want to think about it that way. So I think that's been powerful. I think that it's very easy to build a compelling prototype today with this technology, and we see that all over the place. I think, and they are compelling, right? I mean, it's a good way to start. It's sort of the art of the possible. I think we're entering the phase now, especially where as these prototypes start to gain traction from whether it's from a vendor or built internally, where the governance, compliance, and data protection folks, show up to the table and say, hang on a second here, and start to ask a bunch of hard questions. I often think about Gen AI, I think it's more apt to think about it as a new programming language than a new application. And the reason I say that is, imagine if, tomorrow, all of your employees magically became Java programmers, right? Like every employer at major insurer X woke up and knew Java. Would you say to those folks, hey, knock yourself out, you're free to write any kind of software you want now because you know Java, and deploy it? Well, of course you wouldn't. Like anyone would say that's a ludicrous concept. What about QA? What about compliance? Where are we going to store the code? Who's going to review the code? All the things we do with software. That's coming for Gen AI as well. All you would do though is replace a lot of the words I just said with prompts. Who can write a prompt? Where do the prompts get stored? What prompt was used at what time to generate what data? What version of what large language model was used to generate that data at what time? These are all enterprise scale questions that are now starting to come into the fore as InfoSec and IT and governance gets involved and says, well, wait a minute, we need to apply the same kind of rigor to the use of Gen AI that we would to any kind of new tool that can generate data, right? And so that's why I think that comparison to software programming is a pretty strong one in those regards anyways.
It's funny you say that, because one of the things that I've started to see is a number of IT departments in insurance companies have started to look at, okay, if I'm going to, they've understood the problem that you've addressed and assessed. Yep. A number of them said, okay, great. Well, I'm going to treat it like the rest of my IT, and I'm going to say I'm going to build my own models because then I can control them. Right, great. So I'm going to try to build my own large language model and try to deploy it, and then say, all right, I don't have to worry about versioning because it's my version. I'm going to continue to train that model, train that model, train that model. My own take is I'm not sure that plays, and for a number of reasons. One is just consider the training that is done on existing systems. The largest open source model today, I believe, is Llama 2, that I could then go retrain on top of. Yep. And that's got 70 billion parameters. GPT-3 has 3 times that, and GPT-4 has 10 times GPT-3. This Yep. number is not official, but that's basically what we believe. If you're looking at that, you're going to turn people into sort of low-level programmers in some respects, as opposed to saying, hey, let me use the appropriate tool. And one of the things I love about what generative AI gives us the ability to, exactly as you said, is to issue prompts. So rather than trying to retrain a core language and relearn Java every time, we can use the core language and ground it. And I think that's one of the fundamental misconceptions we're seeing is, on the one hand, the need to control my environment so that I don't let it loose and have everybody become a Java programmer in my company without the appropriate guide rails, is to say, all right, then I'm going to train everybody like they're a low-level engineer. It doesn't work. On the other hand, there do need to be the guardrails in place. And one of the cool things I think about in terms of how generative AI has developed, particularly the GPT models have developed, is our ability to lever a stayed model with then technology on top, an application layer, like what Indica brings to the table, gives us the ability to focus in on training people to manage the prompts, to training people to figuring out how do I point the solution at the problem I'm trying to solve, as opposed to having everybody become complete generalists in a deep tech.
Yeah, and I think it points out that one of the places I think generative AI will have huge impacts is generically speaking on workflows, enterprise workflows. I think workflows have become increasingly front and center in every aspect of every business, and Gen AI has some huge opportunities there. I think true in insurance, right? Whether it's underwriting, claims, policy servicing, ultimately those are all workflows. Whether they're done by people or technology, there are workflows of some kind happening. And so that, again, back to the sort of co-pilot and bionic arm concept, that's a huge opportunity.
Yeah, it's funny that when I speak with carriers, and I do quite a bit, they give me almost universally within the first 30 to 60 minutes of a conversation with a business leader around AI, we have our list of projects we want to go do. And we're keeping an informal tally over at Microsoft right now. The lists range from 50 projects to 150 projects. Yeah. Nobody's got a list of here's the 2 or 3. It's like, oh, I can do this. This becomes my Swiss Army knife of things I can go do with AI, because generative AI changes the way we look at operations. So they go, all right, which ones do I do first?
For sure.
And part of the interesting challenge has been to identify how do we pick the first one and the next one and the next one as it's coming along. So from my perspective, we're coming at it with saying, well, there's some ones that are very easy to do, that are very that don't take an awful lot of work and don't really change the way people do their job, just make it a whole lot easier. For example, if I want to, if anybody is in a company of any size, they have at some point a knowledge base, right? They have some sort of intranet site that's got a little search bar at the top, and the search bar at the top is going to go try to search, and everybody's become an expert at trying to figure out how to write the right question.
Yep.
We don't have to do that anymore. We can just point GPT at that, and go with semantic search. Tom, that's one of the first things you said. Semantic search is so easy, we can just do it, right? That's the thing. As we get to the cases around, all right, now how do I go to my core insurance processes? Now you actually have to start thinking about the question, what problem are you actually trying to solve? Because if the problem I'm trying to solve is, how do I OCR, or how do I actually have a computer be able to look at what this thing is? That's a relatively simple problem. If the problem I'm trying to solve is, how do I know what that submission is and how does it fit into my business process? Then that becomes a higher level problem. And that's where I think application software really, really comes in. I wouldn't just say comes in handy. I think it becomes essential to how they do it. So guidance we're providing to carriers now is, look, you can use the base tools for the simple stuff, but when it comes down to doing the more complicated stuff, ask yourself, what problem am I trying to solve?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I didn't invent this, but I've seen it. I think it's a useful way to frame the problem. Is if you imagine a 2x2 matrix, the question is how complex is the problem, and what is the cost of it being wrong, the answer being wrong, and that's a good way to kind of think about, not that you shouldn't do those kinds of use cases, but to your point about it's more than just a prototype using ChatGPT. There's a lot more to think about when you're in that upper right quadrant. I think that the internet search would be a good one, where it's like it's a high scale problem but a low risk problem, right? So I think you can, and I think that's why we've seen a lot of customers start there. I think I always push customers when we come to a meeting and they say, well, we want to use Gen AI for this problem. I always say, well, you're sort of giving the answer before you've asked the question. So let's back up a little bit and make sure we understand what questions are trying to be answered here. Maybe it's the right approach, maybe it's not the right approach, but regardless, what is the outcome you're trying to drive? What is the difference between today and tomorrow you would like to see? And then let's work backwards to get there and figure out what the right prescription is for that. So I think that's broadly something we've found to be super valuable, is to get the team together with a customer and really start there and do a bunch of sort of discovery in terms of outcomes that are going to make this a win, at the end of the day. It seems obvious, but I get it. It can get lost in the fog, right? Like, we think we understand the project, we think we know why we're doing it, but getting that next level of definition is really vital.
Yeah, it's I agree with you. And this is one of the things where I think the difference between getting a really good prototype and getting a really good result really gets distinguished. If you get a really good prototype, you can show off the tech. Hey, look at all this tech I can use. What can I do for it? Great.
Yep.
If you want to actually get a good business result, I think you start with, what problem am I trying to solve? You figure out the parameters of that problem. This is standard, almost business school 101, if you will, right?
Yep.
What problem am I trying to solve? What are the metrics I think I'm going to be trying to impact? And then from there, how do I hypothesize? What are the capabilities I need to get from point A to point B? And that's when you pull in the tech. Now, the cool thing is, the tech has gotten a whole lot better at doing a whole lot more things, particularly around summarizing, creating content, guessing what the next word in the sentence would be, because that's what GPT does. Those types of things are really critical for giving us the ability to solve a lot more problems. But at the end of the day, we still got to come back to, what problem am I trying to solve? Great example, some work we're doing together in terms of just submissions submissions for claims for commercial entities, right? If I've got a commercial property claim, I have business interruption, I have all of the, I have to figure out how many days lost of revenue I have. I got to figure out also what are the specific damages, if I have any liability, any contingent liability. And what ends up happening when somebody gives that submission is they throw in 1,000 documents, 3 emails, 2 reports, a fire brigade report, and so forth. And somebody's got to go sort all through all of that. That's the problem we look at. And then we decompose it into, all right, what do I do? Well, I need to understand first, where's the data? How do I actually get the right summary of what I'm looking at? How do I understand what I'm looking at? How do I query it? How do I put it in the right spots? That's when you start to look at the end-to-end solution. And I think if customers or carriers come at it from that perspective, problem, hypothesis, solution, a whole lot more value than if they come, hey, what can I use this tech for?
Yeah, absolutely. Just for the audience, if you'd like now, with 10 minutes remaining, to add your questions to the question window in the webinar, GoToWebinar software, we can start to take those. I think we've seen a few flow in here now. Maybe go. So this is kind of a little bit building on your last point, Jim. A question is maybe beyond beyond the sort of internet search you've seen as a low-hanging use case that you're seeing tackled. Maybe what are the 2 or 3 others that are jumping up when in your travels when you talk to insurers in terms of maybe the ones who've gone down the path a little bit further and have that sort of outcome framing. What are they tackling next, do you think, with this technology?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to circle back my answer to the very first problem we identified. The insurance industry itself is facing some substantial financial impacts. So the first question is, how can I save money, right? I had a friend in the insurance industry who said insurers make money 3 ways. They sell more policies, they pay less on the policies they've actually got, and they make money on float. And so focusing in on the how do I pay less on the policies that I got, that's not to screw customers, but to avoid cost and be much more efficient. If loss ratios are going the wrong way, the question is, how do I actually make my business more efficient and more accurate in the use of claims? So that's where we're seeing the use of the question of how do I take in data around my claims in a manner where I can use that data very efficiently and, more importantly, very accurately. So those questions come in a ton. And this isn't just about, submissions of commercial claims like we talked about, just a few minutes ago. But things like, I've made a first notice of loss call and I've got to summarize that call. Well, somebody's manually doing that today. Well, I can use the technology to give you a pretty good summary and a pretty searchable summary with some traceability to it. That's a very high value add because it lowers 2 things. It lowers the cost of manual operations, but it also speeds up claim, and everybody knows faster claims are not only improve customer satisfaction, they tend to be cheaper claims.
Yeah, there's a question that's sort of as a corollary to that. Can Gen AI be used to analyze and interpret insurance policies? And what I would say to that, just building on your last point, is not only can it be used to kind of summarize FNOL, you could then take that summary and ask it to compare it to the policy in force and start to generate an initial view of these losses appear to be covered, these losses appear to be not covered, right? And so that ability to respond to the customer quickly, which the same is true on the claim side as is in underwriting. On underwriting, your speed to quote has a huge impact on winning the business. In claims, your speed to servicing has a huge impact on renewal and customer satisfaction. So it is funny. I think that maybe going into this a few years ago, I would have said that eliminating or reducing costs would be number 1 on the list of benefits from AI. This is prior to Gen AI. This is the dawn of kind of AI in the enterprise. More and more, what I hear is it's all about speed, which is tied to efficiency, right? If I'm more efficient, I'm faster. If I'm more efficient as an underwriter, I can get to a quote faster. If I'm more efficient as a claims adjuster, I can get to that adjudication faster. I think it's partly because if you look at the pressure that some of the big carriers have had from the insurtech startups who start with a blank canvas, they don't have legacy, technology and process, but they also don't have the advantage of scale. What I see is the carriers that we primarily work with, the big established carriers, are looking to use this as a leveling of the playing field, number 1, so they're not disadvantaged by their legacy process and technology. But number 2, a way to really exploit the scale advantages they have in their balance sheets and so forth. So those unlocks are very front and center, I think, to the adoption and enthusiasm of these technologies.
Yeah, I at the risk of agreeing with everything you said, I agree with everything you said. One thing, a specific use case that might jump off the page, though, around in terms of interpreting and analyzing contracts. A couple of carriers we've talked with have gone down the route of actually looking particularly at complex contracts, whether you're thinking about a treaty in re or thinking about like a large enterprise who's got a multi-layered contract, there's a lot of posting over the wall. Here's this change to this term, here's this change to that term, and so on.
Yep.
The ability of generative AI actually to compare and identify adherence to standard terms versus non-standard terms is really important. And it's actually something that's really easy to do, because the alternative to doing that is having a human eyeball things and go, where am I in that contract?
Yep.
That is not only an efficiency driver, it's an accuracy driver. And it plays out in underwriting and in contracts, but it also plays out in claims, because we see this where we'll have people who have, I'm on the 2017 version of this contract, the 2019 version of that contract, and the ability to actually correlate the claim back to the actual contract term. That's a key element of understanding how we can be more effective, not just more efficient.
Absolutely. I've heard the very same pain point, that I think that one of the secrets in the insurance industry is that, especially in commercial lines, when a claim comes in, it often has to go to a lawyer to go read the policy and make a determination. So, that is slow and expensive process, right?
Yeah, and not to disrespect any lawyers, but lawyers, genuinely speaking, don't like just having to go look up stuff. That's not why they went to law school.
100%. Yeah, I think that the funny part about, we touched on the sort of ability to alter headcount with this technology. What I found is that the reality, at least in the United States, is that we're still in a very tight labor market. If anything, carriers are frustrated they can't find more underwriters, or claims adjudicators. It's a skilled position, and there just aren't. It's not like there are tens of thousands of people, available to hire in those regards. So this efficiency gain is not so much a, I want to reduce headcount. I've not heard that once. It's much more, if my business doubles in 5 years, I don't think I can find the people to do that. So how will I do that? If those are my goals. I think that is very much the framing that I've heard in talking to our customers and prospects.
I think that's very similar to what we're seeing as well. What I think that we're going to see is a scaling of this. One of the interesting things when you look at scaling is you're going to see scaling out. What are the additional use cases that I'm getting at, but also scaling up. I thought I'd end sort of the Microsoft view, and this is to quote somebody who was quoting somebody else inside my company. Nobody gets on an airplane these days and goes, "Oh, good, the autopilot's here, we can fly." They often don't get on the plane and say, "Oh, good, the co-pilot's here, we can fly." Say, "Oh, okay, the pilot's there, we can fly." We're going to use this technology to enable the people who are flying the plane for the company actually do their jobs a little bit easier, take rote tasks out of their way, but do it in a manner where we can let that person be much more effective at their job. That'll enable us lateral scale because they'll be able to do more things.
Yep.
But also enable us to do vertical scale because they won't be stuck in the weeds on the sort of the mundane, but also the analytics themselves, the prep work that they could otherwise be using for much more effective tasks.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I think we're at time, Jim. So really enjoyed this. I think we dug into a number of critical areas here. So hope the audience enjoyed the conversation. We'll make this available on recording as well, but certainly enjoyed talking to you today.
Always a pleasure to chat with you, Tom, and thanks again for your time.
Excellent. Caroline, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you again, Jim and Tom, for a great discussion. Like Tom mentioned, we'll be sharing a copy of the recording, so please keep an eye out in your inboxes. And thank you again, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.